Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading Manitou Blood by Graham Masterton, and this week we will be starting on Chapter 7, Bloodline. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Even though he knew she was dead, it was hard for Frank to believe that Susan Fireman wasn't staring at him, and that she wasn't about to speak to him. He felt as if his skin were shrinking, and it took all of his strength not to turn around and hurry out of the room. He slowly approached the bed and bent forward to examine her, so closely that he could have felt her breath on his face if she were still alive. But no, she wasn't breathing, and although her eyes were wide open, they were focused on nothing at all. All the same, she still had that small, secretive smile, as if it amused her that she was dead, and found it funny that she had unnerved him so much. "Susan?" he said, and he shook her shoulder just to make sure. At that moment, Dr. Gathering came in, carrying an untidy sheaf of medical records. She can't hear you, Frank." "No, George, I know. Sister Perpetua told me she'd shuffled off the mortal coil. I thought you'd be here." "Yes," said Frank. He tried to sound efficient and practical, even though his heart was still hammering. "We're going to need a full post-mortem, and we're going to need it pronto, especially the bloods." George dropped some of his papers onto the floor and bent down to pick them up. "It's Dante's Inferno down in the ER. "I know, I was down there. It looks as if it's going to get worse." "Well, the death troll has a theory that this could be a Western variant of dengue hemorrhagic fever." "Oh, does he? Well, I suppose he has to find some way of justifying that all-expenses-paid trip to Bangkok." George peered over at Susan Fireman. "To be fair, this does seem to exhibit several similarities to DHF. It starts with a minor respiratory infection, doesn't it? And that could account for the nightmares. Then there's a period of extreme sensitivity to bright light, followed by total collapse and a catastrophic drop in blood pressure." "Sure, but so far as I'm aware, people who get DHF don't feel an unquenchable thirst for other people's blood, and they don't go cutting their children's throats to get it." "True, but the death troll was careful to say variant." "Well, he would. He's a politician, not a doctor." Frank turned back to Susan Fireman. He felt reluctant to leave her because he knew that he would never see her again, not in one piece anyhow. The pathologists would cut open her breastbone with surgical shears and rummage through her organs, and then they would open up the top of her skull with an oscillating autopsy saw and lift out her brain. George said, "The reason I came up here, the death troll says that you should take the rest of the day off and get some rest. He'd like you back here at 2 a.m. to help out the night shift." "I'm fine, George. I'd rather stay here." "Frank, you won't be any good to anybody if you're totally bushed. You know that. Go home and relax. We'll call you if there's a crisis." "This isn't a crisis?" "Not yet. This is only your ordinary, everyday, garden variety disaster." Frank reluctantly left the Sisters of Jerusalem and walked home. Midtown, the streets were still screaming with sirens, and medical helicopters were clattering overhead, and people were hurrying in every direction as if the end of the world was coming. It started to rain, and the rain was so warm that it felt like blood. He suddenly realized how tired he was and how unsettled. There was nothing worse than having to deal with patients who couldn't be saved, no matter how hard he tried to keep them alive. He found himself praying that he wouldn't come across somebody throwing up blood in a doorway, because he would have to stop and take him back to the emergency room. George had been right. He badly needed to rest and to think and to get himself ready for a very arduous night. He heard a woman screaming somewhere on the next block and a man shouting, "Get away from me! Get away from me!" Then he heard breaking glass and 2 loud bangs that could have been gunfire. He had seen disaster movies in which the social fabric had torn apart almost immediately, but he had never believed that it would really happen, not until now. 6th and 5th Avenues were both blocked off by police barricades, so it took him nearly 20 minutes to reach the tree-lined street in Murray Hill where he lived, and by the time he got there his pants were chafing with sweat and his shirt was clinging to his back. It was almost 5 o'clock now, 91 degrees, with 87% humidity. The afternoon had turned a dull bronze color, as if it were going to thunder. He climbed the white stone steps to his front door. Halfway up, he caught sight of a middle-aged man kneeling by the mailbox on the corner of the street. He stopped and took off his sunglasses so that he could see better. The man's face was crudely smeared with bright blue paint so that it looked like an African tribal mask, and his t-shirt had ridden up under his arms so that his big white belly hung down. He was gripping one leg of the mailbox with both hands, as if he were terrified that he was going to fly off the face of the earth. As Frank watched him, his belly convulsed and convulsed again, and a fountain of dark ruby vomit gushed out of his mouth and splattered onto the sidewalk. Frank took out his cell phone and punched out 911, but it beeped and nobody answered. He hesitated. He was a doctor. It was his moral duty to go to the man's assistance, but he knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to help him, and the man had probably murdered 2 or 3 people to drink so much blood. The man slowly turned his head toward him, and he looked utterly desolate. Frank hesitated a moment longer, but then he put his sunglasses back on, climbed up the last 3 steps, and opened up his front door. He went through and closed it behind him. Click. The apartment building was stuffy and hushed and dimly lit. It was like living in an Edward Hopper painting. There were dusty silk lilies in a tall green vase beside the umbrella stand, and a tall rectangular mirror in which one only seemed to be able to see half of oneself, or the back of somebody disappearing through a doorway. Somewhere up at the top of the building, someone was vacuum cleaning, and as he climbed up to his 2nd-story apartment, Frank heard sad, reflective piano music. Debussy, maybe, or Sauté. As he was about to unlock his apartment door, his key raised. He thought about the blue-faced man in the street. He was tempted to go back. After all, if the man was suffering from the same condition that had killed Susan Fireman, he hadn't wanted to murder anybody. He had been driven to do it by his raging thirst for human blood. But the same could be said of crackheads who murdered innocent people to feed their addiction, or drunk drivers who knocked down school children. Frank had told Susan Fireman that he didn't judge his patients, but he had been lying. He had nothing but contempt for people who injured themselves or others through willful stupidity or lack of self-control. Once he had sat all night by the bedside of a 27-year-old woman who had been so drunk that she had swallowed concentrated drain cleaner, and he had never been able to find it in his heart to forgive her for what she had done to herself. He hadn't forgiven Susan Fireman either for murdering her friends instead of trying to get medical help. All the same, he regretted that she was dead. For some reason, he felt that she had the answer to something that he needed to understand. His apartment was high-ceilinged and austere, with dark brown carpets and cream-colored walls and a few abstract paintings in varying shades of brown and cream. The furniture was Italian, mahogany-colored leather, very square and very expensive. In one corner there was a Bang & Olufsen CD player. In the opposite corner stood a 1920s-style cabinet, which contained bottles of liquor and jazz-age cocktail glasses. Frank was 37 in January, and he was still married, although he and Christina had already talked about divorce. The starkness of this apartment was in direct contrast to their house in Darien, Connecticut, which was crammed with antique colonial furniture and embroidered cushions and china dogs. Frank had felt that Christina was cluttering up his head with so many knickknacks and frills that there wasn't any space left for serious thinking. One day he had gone to the Sisters of Jerusalem and stayed late in gastroenterology and never returned home. Even today, 7 months later, he couldn't really explain why, not to anybody else. He spent long evenings alone, reading, or listening to music, or staring at the wall and doing nothing at all. Maybe, like many doctors, he had secretly begun to wonder what he was doing, saving lives that were nothing but a waste of everybody's time, including the people who were living them. He stripped off his chilly, sweat-soaked clothes and climbed into his black glass shower cubicle with a volcanic stone base. As he soaped himself, he could see half of his face in the circular shaving mirror next to the black marble basin, as if he were being spied on from a parallel existence. He toweled himself with a dark brown towel and rubbed his chest with Dolce & Gabbana body lotion. Afterward, with a fresh towel wrapped around his waist, he went into the stainless steel kitchen and took a bottle of Perrier water out of the icebox. He would have preferred a Heineken, but he was going to need all of his concentration when he went back to the Sisters of Jerusalem in the early hours of the morning. He supposed he ought to eat something, even if it was only a cheese sandwich, but he didn't feel hungry. He kept thinking about Susan Fireman, staring at him with those china blue eyes, and the blue-faced man vomiting blood on the street outside. He lay back on his king-size bed. In the corner of his bedroom was the only antique in the whole apartment, an oval mirror that was reputed to have belonged to Ulysses S. Grant, and which Grant had taken with him on his campaign in Chattanooga. Frank didn't particularly like it, but it was worth more than $250,000, and he didn't want Christina to get her hands on it. He switched on the wall-mounted plasma screen television. Almost every channel was still running minute-by-minute news of the vampire epidemic. Cases had been reported as far uptown as 125th Street, and Mayor Brandisi had ordered police checkpoints set up on all bridges and tunnels, although he had to admit that he didn't really know what they were supposed to be looking for, apart from people who appeared to be sick or who had covered themselves with sunblock. So far, more than 200 victims had been found with their throats cut, and the mayor estimated that there could be twice, maybe 3 times more. Frank switched off the television and lay back on his dark brown sheets. His apartment was soundproofed, but he could still hear sirens echoing and the dull thumping of helicopters. He wondered what it would be like if he woke up to find that he was the only person in Manhattan left alive. He imagined himself wandering from street to echoing street, past abandoned taxis and wind-blown newspapers. He fell asleep. When he was an intern, he had trained himself to sleep whenever he had the chance, and he could sleep deeply and dreamlessly and wake up exactly when he knew that he would be called for, to the second. Outside his bedroom window, the howling of sirens went on like wolves. Daylight disappeared early, without any sunset, and by 9 o'clock it was dark. He carried on sleeping, lying on his back, motionless, except for the slightly curled fingers of his left hand, which occasionally twitched. A few minutes after 11:30, there was a creaking noise at his window. It didn't penetrate his sleep, even when it was followed by a sharp click, and then the sticky sound of rubber seals being parted as his window was opened. A warm surge of air swelled into the room, smelling of gasoline fumes and hot concrete and steam. He thought he felt somebody stroke his forehead and play with his hair. He snorted and irritably shook his head. He didn't want to wake up yet, and he didn't want to dream. He never allowed himself to dream. In dreams, people told you critically important things that you couldn't understand, and you formed attachments to people who didn't exist. "Frank," said a soft voice. He snorted again, but still refused to wake up. "Frank, it's me." He turned over, tugging at his sheet. "Frank, it's no use pretending. I know you can hear me." He licked his lips, which felt very dry. Then he gradually opened his eyes. Someone was sitting on the bed, right next to him, a woman wearing something pale. The light from the hallway was shining behind her head so that he couldn't clearly see her face. He lifted one arm to shield his eyes and said, "Christina? I thought you were going to sleep forever." "What the hell are you doing here?" He tried to sit up, but the woman pressed a cold hand flat against his chest and pushed him firmly back down again. "Christina, there's a full-scale medical emergency. You shouldn't have come to the city." "But I'm not Christina, whoever Christina is." Frank reached across and switched on the square bedside lamp. "Oh, my God," he said when he saw who the woman was. "Oh, God, it can't be." Susan Fireman reached out and took hold of his hand. Her eyes still seemed unfocused, and her face was still pallid, but she was smiling at him, and there was no doubt that she was alive. "I thought you were dead," said Frank in a voice that sounded like somebody else's. "You died, didn't you? Your heart stopped." "I thought you would have known about death, being a doctor." "What are you talking about?" "Death is for people who were born to die, not for people like me." Frank took hold of her wrist, lifted her arm away, and sat up straight. Susan Fireman continued to smile at him, her expression so beatific that it almost looked as if she were mad, or an angel, or a nun who had experienced a divine revelation. "Frank," she admonished him, "you mustn't take death so literally." "I'm dreaming," he said. He slapped himself hard across the face. "Shit, I'm not dreaming. Maybe I'm dreaming that I'm dreaming." Susan Fireman touched his cheek with her fingertips, and they were very cold. "I know that you liked me. I know that you found me attractive. I saw how sad you were when you thought that I was dead." "For Christ's sake, you are dead!" Frank rolled across the bed, away from her, and stood up. "I was there when you died. They tried to resuscitate you, but they couldn't. I'm dreaming this, or hallucinating. Maybe I've contracted your infection. Maybe this is one of those nightmares." "Frank, I thought that you liked me. Like you? How can I like you? You're dead, and it's absolutely impossible that you're here. Logically, medically, it's impossible. Susan Fireman stood up, too, and walked around the bed. She moved with an extraordinary jerking motion, as if she were in a film, and some of the frames were missing. She raised both arms as if she wanted him to embrace her. I'm here, Frank, and that's the only logic that means anything. How did you get in? He said, and almost as he said it, he caught sight of the bedroom window, tilted ajar. I can get in anywhere. The pale ones always can. Frank still thought that he was dreaming. Susan Fireman had denied any knowledge of the pale ones, hadn't she? I'm going to wake up, he told her. On the count of 3, I'm going to wake up, and you, my dear, will no longer be here. 1, 2, 3. We could be so good together, Frank. You could be a pale one, too. He closed his eyes tight, waited, and then opened them again. But Susan Fireman was still standing in front of him. If I can't make you disappear, I want you to go. However you manage to get in here, I want you to leave the same way. But Frank, don't you want to know what happened to me? Don't you want to find out why all of these people seem to be sick? What are you talking about? This epidemic. All of these people killing their friends and their loved ones and drinking their blood. You know why they're doing it? Of course. It happened to me, didn't it? Why didn't you say something before, when you were in the hospital? She reached her hand out again, but Frank stepped back and said, Just don't touch me, okay? Frank, don't be angry with me. If I had understood what was happening to me when I was in the hospital, I would have told you, I promise you. But I didn't, not then. I needed to pass through, to see it from the other side. So you can tell me now? This is crazy. I must be suffering from overwork. She smiled at him slyly. First things first, she told him. She crossed her arms and lifted off her nightdress so that she was naked. Frank said nothing, but watched her warily, keeping his hands by his sides and breathing very deeply. He had been caught before by a frustrated female patient who had accused him of molesting her, and it had led to months of legal argument and thousands of dollars of expense. He didn't want anything like that to happen again. Susan Fireman sat down on the bed. Come here, she said. Frank shook his head. No way. 1, I don't believe that this is really happening. You're some kind of hallucination, and I don't even know why I'm talking to you. And 2, if this is happening and you are real, I don't want to have anything to do with you. Frank, this isn't a dream. You're awake. How can I be? Even if you didn't die, you couldn't have left the hospital and climbed in through my window. There's a sheer drop out there, 75 feet at least. Any wall can be climbed, Frank, if you have the ability to climb it. She waited for a moment, and then she stood up again. He backed away from her until he reached the bedroom wall, and he couldn't back away any further. She came up so close to him that he could feel how cold she was. It was almost as if she was draining the warmth right out of the surrounding air. You're desperate to find out what happened to me, aren't you? And you want me, too. You know you do. She reached down and took hold of him through his thin blue-striped cotton shorts. Her fingers were very cold. "You see," she challenged him, "I was right on both accounts. I am real, and you do want me." Frank had never felt anything like this, ever. He was so frightened that he was shaking. What was happening to him was the stuff of insanity. Susan Fireman was dead, and so she couldn't have climbed into his window, and she couldn't be talking to him now. He couldn't think straight. It seemed as if the only way to escape from this nightmare was to live through it until he woke up. Very softly, Susan Fireman said, "I didn't know it myself. Not until now, but there have always been other people." Frank couldn't speak. The coldness of her hand had made him feel numb, and the coldness was beginning to penetrate throughout his entire body. Other people. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Different people who live different lives in darkness and shadows and closed boxes. With one hand, she tugged down his shorts, and they dropped onto the floor around his ankles. "They've always been with us," she whispered. "They've always been hiding and waiting, and now they're free." Frank felt totally helpless, as if he had to do whatever she told him to do. "You're mine now, Frank," she panted. "My protégé, one to another, like Chinese whispers. That's how it goes. It's a secret message." Frank fell sideways and lay there, shivering, like a dog dragged out of a river. Susan Fireman turned to him so that their faces were only 3 or 4 inches apart, almost too close for Frank to focus. "A secret message," she breathed. "What secret message? I don't understand." She kissed him twice. "They brought it all the way from the home country, don't you see? Hidden in their blood." "Who did?" he croaked. "Who are you talking about?" "The Strigoi, they call themselves. The people who never die." "The Strigoi?" "That's right. And now they've brought their message here, and we can help them to spread it. Me and you and anybody else we choose. It isn't a written message, not a message that anybody can whisper." She sat up and looked down at him. "In a few hours, my darling Frank, you will pass through too and understand everything." He tried to lift his head, but she pushed him back down. "There's one more thing," she said. "We have to make sure." She climbed on top of him, and with those thin, chilly limbs, she straddled him. "What are you doing?" he said. He was beginning to wonder if this wasn't a nightmare after all, and that Susan Fireman, even if she was dead, was really here. She looked down at him. Her eyes looked dreamy, but she was no longer smiling. "We have to make sure, Frank," she repeated. He tried to struggle himself up. She laughed and pirouetted away from him across the bedroom. She flickered as she danced like an old hand-cranked movie. Frank hobbled into the bathroom, feeling as if he had been fighting in an alley and lost. He switched on the light and stared at himself in the mirror, and he had never seen himself looking so haggard. How could he be dreaming when he could twist the faucet and splash his face with warm water? He pressed his face into a towel. I can feel this, and I can't wake up. I'm going to have to accept that it's real. As crazy as it is, as scary as it is, it's real. He dropped the towel onto the counter and went back into the bedroom. Okay, he said, supposing this isn't a nightmare, why don't you tell me what the hell is going on? But there was no answer. Susan Fireman wasn't there. Susan? He demanded. He stalked through to the living room, but there was no sign of her. Not only that, the security chain was still fastened, so she couldn't have slipped out through the front door. He switched on the fluorescent light in the kitchen, but that was empty too. The only sound was the humming of the icebox. He returned to the bedroom. Susan? This is ridiculous. He opened the closet. She wasn't hiding in there. There was only an inch clearance under the bed, so she couldn't be hiding there either. He searched his apartment again. He even looked in the dirty clothes hamper. She was gone, and there was absolutely no trace that she had ever been there, except for the rumpled-up bed. He looked up at the window, but it was 5 feet up from the floor, and it was only open 3 or 4 inches. Even if she had managed to climb in that way, he very much doubted that she could have climbed out. There was nothing around that she could have stood on to reach it. I'm losing my mind, he told himself. He stared back at himself from the mirror in the hallway, and his reflection didn't even try to deny it. Chapter 8. Bloodbath. After Bertle hung up on me, I sat in my Alexander Woolcott chair for a while, drinking and thinking. Even though I had turned down the volume, the TV news channels were still filled with flickering images of people plastered in blood, and the numbers of dead and murdered were clocking up higher and higher, like the score on a pinball machine, with no sign of them slowing down. If I couldn't persuade Amelia to talk to the city authorities, I had to try to talk to them myself, didn't I? Even though I knew how skeptical they would be. I couldn't just sit here in this tatty old chair drinking Guinness and watch all of these people die. But what if the authorities simply refused to believe me, which they probably wouldn't? Maybe I should make another attempt to contact Singing Rock. He probably wouldn't agree to bring the malevolent thing back to my bedroom so that I could see it for myself, but maybe he could tell me something about it and why it was spreading this blood-drinking epidemic. Even a name would help. I could look it up on the internet. You'd be surprised what malevolent things you can find on the internet. I once looked up Miss Quamacus, the Algonquin wonder worker who had killed Singing Rock and had almost killed me and Karen too, and I found an actual picture of him on some obscure website devoted to Keeler Webb, a 19th century frontier photographer. There he was, Miss Quamacus, standing in the background of a daguerreotype, taken at Pyramid Lake in 1865. He was wearing a tall black stovepipe hat, and he was glaring at me as if he had known when this picture was taken that I would be looking at it one day in 140 years' time. He was stony-faced, his cheeks scarred with magical stigmata, and his deep-set, glittering eyes looked like cockroaches nestling under a window ledge. There hadn't been very much text to accompany the picture, except a brief excerpt from Native American Magic by Roland Hunsiger and Merriam West. Miss Quamacus was said to have possessed the power to appear in several different places simultaneously, sometimes thousands of miles apart. He was also credited with the ability to travel through time by swallowing blazing oil and being reborn in the body of any unsuspecting woman who happened to be in the locality of his self-immolation, either in the future or in the past, whichever he chose. Miscomachus and his followers fought several notably bloody battles against the earliest Dutch settlers in New Amsterdam, and the wooden palisades for which Wall Street was named were specifically built to keep out his marauding warriors. Although Miscomachus's tribe was scattered in the spring of 1655, he made a solemn oath that one day he would drive out every last colonist. It is seriously thought by many Native American elders that the catastrophic collapse of several buildings in Manhattan in the 1990s was a last attempt by Miscomachus to destroy the white invaders and drive them from American soil. They even believe that he might have succeeded had not his destruction of high-tension power cables led to a massive discharge of electrical energy, which vaporized his Manitou, or spirit, and dispersed it amongst the four elements. He is now condemned to perpetual imprisonment in the earth, the fire, the wind, and the rain. Well, the name Miscomachus still gave me a rusty taste in my mouth, even after all these years. He had first come into my life when he had chosen Karen as the host for his first reincarnation. Once he was reborn out of Karen's body, he had tried to summon the great old ones, the Indian gods of total destruction, the ones who lived in the empty time, before time as we know it had actually begun. He had almost succeeded, but Singing Rock had helped me to stop him. Miscomachus had tried to be reincarnated again and again, and Singing Rock had been killed as we struggled to send him back to the happy hunting ground once and for all. Miscomachus was an incredibly powerful wonder worker, no doubt about it, but in the end it was no contest. His magic might have been pretty damn devastating in the days of rain dances and war parties, but he didn't stand a chance against 21st century technology. Who's going to be bothered to blow magic powders into the wind to find herds of buffalo when there's a Walmart only 10 minutes down the road with pre-packed USDA-grade steak? Who needs to go to a sweat lodge in search of visions when they can buy ecstasy and DVD players with cinema-quality sound? The Indians were simply left behind, standing with their pipes and their feathers and their beads beside the highway, while the rest of the world went careening onward into the future. Even Singing Rock used to say, "It's no use crying about Native American magic, my friend. It's one of those things we don't need anymore, like cotton diapers and typewriters." I picked up the bracelet that Singing Rock had given me and slipped it back on. Its black stones looked very dull now, for some reason, as if all the life had gone out of them. I clasped my right hand around it and closed my eyes. Singing Rock, I really need your help right now. I admit that we didn't have the guts to look when you first tried to show us what was causing Ted's nightmares. We were cadmium yellow. I believe it. I admit it. But that doesn't mean that I don't deeply appreciate what you did for us and that I don't admire your bravery. Singing Rock, I'm begging you now. I'll make any sacrifice you want me to. Anything. People are dying out there, hundreds of people, and it seems to me that this thing that's been causing Ted's nightmares, well, it could just be responsible for killing these other people too. I waited, listening for some kind of response, a tap on the window, or a whisper, or a scratch on the wall. All the time the day gradually grew darker, and the sirens went on whooping and wailing. I heard screaming and a catastrophic crash of glass, like a storefront window being smashed, and shots. Helicopters were beating over Central Park like distant tom-toms. Singing Rock, please. I know that I must have appeared ungrateful for what you did for me, but believe me, I thought it was very, very amazing. If you can't conjure up that actual thing a second time, or if you don't feel in the mood, at least just give me a clue. Tell me what that thing is, or what it's called. Tell me where it comes from, or what it wants. I heard people running along 17th Street, scores of them. I stood up and went to the window just in time to see them crossing 6th Avenue. There must have been over 200 of them, men mostly, but some women, and I had no idea why they were running. They weren't crying or shouting, only running. It was one of the scariest things that I had ever witnessed. They turned northward, and they were gone, although I could still hear the clattering sound of their feet for almost 15 seconds afterward. "That's it, Harry," I said out loud. "Doomsday scenario." I turned back into my gloomy room and jumped with shock. Singing Rock was standing in the darkest corner. I could see the light reflected from his glasses and his greased back hair and the black suit that he had been buried in. He wasn't entirely substantial. I could still see the bookcase behind him and even the titles of the books. "Hello, Harry," he said. His voice had a crumply quality like tissue paper or the wind blowing into a sports reporter's microphone. "Singing Rock, I was beginning to think that you weren't speaking to me." There are some friends and some enemies on whom we can never turn our backs. "So I'm which, enemy or friend?" "You have to ask me?" "No, of course not. I'm sorry. If I wasn't your friend, you wouldn't have drummed up that thing for me, whatever it was." "If that's what you wish to believe." I circled cautiously around the table, but the closer I got to Singing Rock, the dimmer he became, until I could barely make him out at all, only his lips moving. I stepped back, and he became clearer. He would have been nearly 75 now if he had lived, but he hadn't changed. I guess that's the only positive thing you can say about death. It doesn't age you. "How are you doing?" I asked him. "I am dead, Harry Erskine. I exist only in the great world of blackness beneath your feet. That's how I am doing." "But you know what this thing is, don't you? You know why all of these people are having nightmares and drinking blood. I mean, they're killing each other out there, Singing Rock. They're cutting each other's throats. Women, children, anybody. It's a massacre." "Yes, I am aware of that. I can see those innocents who have been murdered. Their spirits are falling into the blackness below, like the snow falls in winter." "You can't show me that thing again? That presence, whatever it was? I saw it out of the corner of my eye. It was kind of dark and stretchy, and I heard it whispering, too." Singing Rock shook his head. "I would show you, Harry Erskine, if I could. I don't blame you for your lack of courage. It is a creature of the darkest dark, from a very ancient heritage of which I know nothing. I caught it by surprise and led it here with an old Lakota spell, but it soon broke free, and it will not be surprised a second time." "Do you have any idea what it is, or where it comes from?" "I can tell you its name only by suggestion. If I were to speak it or to write it, I would instantly attract its attention, and it would come after you faster than a ravenous bear in the forests from which it first emerged. Let me warn you, Harry Erskine, this spirit is greedy and cruel, and it will stop at nothing to spread its kind as far and as fast as it can. Okay, then, if you can only tell me its name by suggestion, suggest away. Not now, but you will know the name when I give it to you. Singing Rock, this is urgent. Mothers are drinking their own baby's blood, even as we speak. But Singing Rock firmly said, no, don't you understand? You are special. By chance, you are the only one who has guessed that the plague has been caused by a spirit and not by a virus. If you were to be killed, who else would guess? Your white doctors have long ago lost touch with the spirit world and with the powers of nature. If they cannot see their enemy wriggling under their microscopes, they refuse to believe that he exists. So how do I convince them? I cannot say. You are a white man, and you know better than I do how to talk to other white men. For God's sake, Singing Rock, you used to be a realtor. You can convince anybody of anything. Singing Rock turned to me, and I thought that he looked weary and sad, and as if he were tired of being dead. I will tell you the name, Harry Erskine. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. I tried to give him an encouraging smile, but it wasn't easy. He began to fade, and after a few moments he had vanished altogether, and the only evidence that he had visited me was the faint aroma of lavender hair oil. But at least he had agreed to help me. I didn't know how he was going to give me the name of the malevolent thing, but I knew that he would keep his promise. It occurred to me, though, that he still hadn't told me if I was his friend or his enemy. Maybe he regarded me as a little of both. I took a shower, standing in the tub with the shower fixture rattling and shaking and letting out explosive sneezes of hot water. Without drying, I wrapped myself up in the thick navy blue towel robe that Karen had given me, with my monogram embroidered on the pocket, and I sat by the open window, perspiring and drinking Guinness and listening to the terrible sounds of the night. Sirens were echoing from every direction, and every now and then I heard masses of people running. Thick brown smoke was rising from the garment district, and helicopters were circling around Times Square with crisscrossing floodlights. Even though I knew that Singing Rock wouldn't let me down, I was becoming increasingly worried and edgy, and I kept getting out of my chair and pacing around the room. I had switched the television off. By 9:15, it was reported that 347 people had died from the vampire plague, and 511 had been found with their throats cut. More people had been murdered in New York City in a single day than were usually murdered in a year. Mayor Brandisi had admitted that it might take days, weeks, or even longer to isolate the cause of the epidemic. Manhattan was now completely sealed off, with roadblocks at every bridge and every tunnel entrance. From Washington, D.C., the president had promised that the federal government would give New York City every conceivable assistance. He also swore that if the epidemic were found to have been caused by terrorists, retribution would be swift and terrible. I was tired and hot, and I was debating with myself whether I ought to go to bed, when I heard a scrabbling noise at my door. I leaned into my cramped little hallway and listened. There was another scrabble, and I called out, "Who's there? Is there anybody there?" There was no reply, but I was sure that there was somebody out there. I tried to peer through the spy hole, but some joker had stuck something over it, chewing gum probably. I waited for a short while, and then I said, "Who is it?" Still no response. It could have been Mrs. Zolbrod's dog, the one that looked like Harpo Marx's wig, or maybe it was a rat. But for some reason, I was certain that it was a person. I could feel his tension, even through 2 inches of door. I could almost hear him sweating. I pressed my ear against the door and held my breath. It was then that he hammered loudly on the door with his fist and almost deafened me. "What is it?" I shouted and opened the door. I didn't recognize him at first because his face was streaked with something thick and black and greasy, and so were his arms. But when he coughed and said, "Help me, dude, I really need some serious help," I realized it was Ted Bush. He looked even more disheveled than he had before. His molten iris T-shirt had a dark sweat stain down the front of it, and his hair was sticking up as if he had been electrocuted. "You'd better come in," I told him. I didn't really want him to come in, but what else could I do? Supposing something gruesome happened to him because I had turned him away. He stumbled into the living room and collapsed into my Alexander Woolcott chair. "I'm burning up, dude," he told me. "How about a glass of water?" No, not water. I can't touch water. Water's going to make it worse." "What's wrong with you? You're sweating buckets. And what's all that black on your face? My God, Ted, you look like Al Jolson." "I'm burning up, dude. It's like my skin's on fire." "You need to go to the hospital. You really do. I can't help you here." "I tried. I went to the Sisters of Jerusalem, but you can't get anywhere near. The whole place was like hundreds of people, all crying and screaming. The doors were shut, and they had cops on the doors to stop people getting in." "Ted, I'm a fortune teller, not a doctor. There's nothing I can do for you except give you a drink." Ted stared at me, his eyes so wide that he looked as if he were mad. "You don't get it, do you? My skin is on fire. After I left you, I tried to walk home, but the sun was burning me, and all I could find was motor oil to cover my face and my arms, but I'm burning even worse. You have to help me, dude, or else I'm going to die." I didn't know what to say to him. It was obvious from the way that he was trembling and clutching himself that he was in agony. But what can you do for somebody who's been infected by spiritual malevolence? Calamine lotion might be good for poison ivy rash, but it doesn't have much effect on cruel and ferocious things from beyond. "I can run you a cold bath," I suggested. "And how about a couple of Anacin? That might help to bring your temperature down." He twitched and sniffed and kept on shuddering like a junkie. I picked up the phone. "I could try calling a doctor, but I don't think there's any point if you can't even get into a hospital." Unexpectedly, he let out a high, coyote-like howl, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "I'm burning!" he screamed. He held up his hands to show me, as if they were actually on fire. "Look at me! I'm burning!" "Listen!" I shouted back at him. "You have to calm down. You might feel like you're burning, but you're not. It's all in your head. It's all in your mind, or your autonomic nervous system, or whatever. Just sit tight and sweat it out. That's all you can do." "But my skin's on fire. I'm shriveling, dude. I'm getting cremated." I decided to run him a cold bath. It might not work, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. Apart from hitting him over the head, very hard, with my heaviest skillet. I'm good at saving the world, but I don't have a whole lot of patience when it comes to individuals. I went through to the bathroom and turned on the big old cold water faucet. The bath was vast, and it had a strange blood-colored stain down one side, as if a young bride had recently been murdered in it. I had been trying to bleach the stain out with Clorox, but it only seemed to make it look more blood-like. The water was brown and not particularly cold, but it would have to do. I was leaning over the bath, checking that the plug was in properly, when somebody wrapped his arm around my neck. I saw something flash in the corner of my eye, and I instinctively ducked my head down just as a craft knife slashed across my face, cutting my left cheek almost down to the bone. Blood sprayed everywhere. It spattered up the side of the bath and blossomed in the water like roses. I twisted myself around, grunting and struggling, and I felt the craft knife cut cold across my knuckles. I was never any good at fighting, but I was shit scared and I was angry, and I lashed out with everything I had like a demented windmill. Ted fell backward, jarring his shoulder against the edge of the door, and then I seized his sweaty t-shirt and hurled him against the towel rack, and then against the basin, and then I heaved him over the side of the bath so that he splashed into the water. He still had the craft knife in his hand, but I grabbed hold of his wrist and bent it so far back that he dropped it. I managed to hold him down on the bottom of the bath, even though he was screaming and kicking and trying to bite me. I picked up the full half-gallon bottle of Clorox from under the back of the bath and hit him with it. Boff, boff, again and again. He was stunned for a moment, but then he gripped the sides of the bath with both hands and tried to pull himself out. I hit him again, and he fell backward. Then I unscrewed the cap from the Clorox and emptied it into his face. I will never be able to forget that shriek of agony as long as I live. He jumped blindly out of the bath. Nobody could have stopped him, not me on my own, not even me and 6 other men. He collided with the door again, and then he staggered across the living room, scattering my Jeu Noir cards, knocking over my framed photograph of Karen and me and little Lucy, breaking the blue glass vase that I had won in Atlantic City. He managed to open the front door and crash his way out of it, hitting the door on the other side of the corridor so hard that he split one of the panels. A muffled voice from inside shouted, "Hey!" I was already feeling a surge of guilt because I knew I could have blinded him. I shouted, "Ted, come back!" and went after him. But by the time I got to the door, he was already lurching toward the top of the stairs. "Ted!" I yelled at him. He turned and raised his head. His face was red and blistered, and smoke was actually rising from his hair. Both eyes were closed, and his lips were puffed up like 2 giant maggots. He opened his mouth and said, "Ta-ta nostro!" "Ted, for Christ's sake, get back here and let me splash some water on you." I don't know if the bleach had poured into his ears and deafened him, or if he simply didn't want to hear me, but he turned back toward the stairs, and it was then that he lost his footing and disappeared like a magic trick. One moment he was standing there, the next moment he was gone. "Ted!" I could hear him tumbling down the stairs, and I was sure that I could even hear his bones cracking, although it was probably the banisters. By the time I reached him, he was lying on the dirty green linoleum on the landing, his neck twisted one way and his body twisted the other. One leg was crooked back in a position that even a contortionist couldn't have managed. I came slowly down the stairs and hunkered down next to him. His eyes were open, but the pupils were sightless and milky white. I know that he had tried to cut my throat, but I still felt overwhelmingly guilty. It wasn't his fault that he had been infected by a malevolent spirit. I stood up, The left side of my face was sticky, and blood was running from my knuckles. "Singing Rock," I shouted. "If you're going to give me a sign, then you'd better get your ass in gear, because I'm running out of time here. You hear me, Singing Rock?" Letitia from the room opposite called out, Harry, is that you? What the hell is going on down there?" There was no point in asking her to call 911. "It's okay," I called back. "Somebody fell, that's all." I stood up, nursing my dripping hand. It was then that I caught sight of a label that had been stuck onto the apartment door right next to me, Mrs. St. John's. She had been handwritten in large red letters, St. John, but most of it had been ripped off so that all that remained was Saint. Don't ask me how I knew that this was the first part of Singing Rock's message. There are times when you just know things, like when one of your friends is in trouble, or somebody's died, or the weather's going to change for the worse. "Okay, Singing Rock," I told him, "an S and a T, but you'd better give me the rest of it real damn quick." Letitia was standing at the top of the stairs with her hair piled high and decked out with purple ribbons. She was wearing a purple satin robe, and she was smoking a small cigar. "Harry," she said hoarsely. "It's the end of the world, Letitia," I told her. "Next time you get down on your knees, you'd better start praying, too." Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of Manitou Blood. And until then, have a great week, everyone.